Okay, so what we're going to do from here is we're going to think through how a minimum wage is likely to affect employment in a competitive labor market compared to a monopsony, and to think about the boundaries around which these predictions are going to be different. This is going to be very helpful for us moving forward when we look at some maybe surprising empirical evidence on the effect of minimum wages on employment. So to start out with, let's just go back to our standard Econ 101, right, competitive model of minimum wages and employment. So we've got some labor market with some labor number of workers and some wage, right? We've got a labor supply, we've got a labor demand, and what we're going to say is, you know, if we've got an equilibrium employment level here, let's go with the numbers in our last problem. So say this is $100, 100 people at $10 an hour, right? If we set a minimum wage above our competitive equilibrium, we're going to have two effects, right? So we set a minimum wage like this. We're going to increase the number of people willing to work. Call this LS min. We're going to decrease the number of firms willing to hire, right? And because of the fact that when we've got fewer firms willing to hire than we've got workers willing to work, the actual number of employees is going to be set by the number of firms willing to hire. We're going to end up with actual employment set by this minimum wage, right? So this has a couple of consequences. It means that as long as our labor demand curve is downward sloping, a minimum wage has to result in reduced employment, right? This has to be the case if we're moving up a downward sloping labor demand curve. But on the other hand, we're going to increase wages for all the workers who keep their jobs, right? So what we're going to end up saying in this sort of situation is that we're going to get a benefit to workers or benefit to labor that's equal to essentially the size of this raise times the number of people still employed, right? But we're going to have a loss to workers given by essentially the value to workers of the jobs that were destroyed, right? The jobs that disappear as a result of the minimum wage. And the size of these two things is actually going to depend a lot on who keeps their job, who loses their job, right? This is the best case scenario where the people who lose their jobs are the people who value the jobs the least, right? So we lose people over here. It could actually be the people who value the jobs the most lose the jobs, and the people who wouldn't have worked other than the minimum wage take the jobs, right? These are all details. Most important thing is we have this unambiguous prediction: increased minimum wage has to reduce labor demanded, which has to reduce employment. Cool. Let's think about what this model is going to predict if instead of a competitive market, we have a market where firms have market power, right? So our downward sloping curve is now going to be marginal product of labor, right? I'll call this WL. Same thing, right? Labor supply curve, marginal product of labor. And, you know, for the sake of usefulness, right, in order to match what we've done before, let's imagine that we're back with the firm we just talked about. So we have a pre-minimum wage of $7.50, pre-minimum wage employment of $75, right? This is going to be our original situation. And let's imagine that we put a minimum wage in place, right? Let's say a minimum wage of something like $12 an hour. What's this going to do to employment? Oh, and sorry, I've got to have here, right? The reason that we've got $7.50 an hour is because that's where our marginal expense of labor equals our marginal revenue product, right? Cool. Okay. So how many people are going to be employed now at this new minimum wage? I'm going to give you a couple of possibilities, and I want you to think about which one you think is going to happen. So one possibility, which I'll call option A, is that we end up with employment where our new minimum wage equals our marginal expense of labor, right? Instead of having employment where marginal expense of labor equals marginal revenue product, it'll be where marginal expense of labor equals the minimum wage. Option B is that we're going to have employment where a new minimum wage equals our marginal revenue product. Option C is going to be where we're going to have employment where our new minimum wage equals our labor supply curve. So think for a minute about what you think is going to happen. Okay. So I'm going to argue that the firm's going to end up hiring at point B. They're going to end up hiring where the new minimum wage is equal to their marginal revenue product. And what that means is, the way I've drawn this here, they're going to end up hiring more people after the minimum wage increase than they hired before the minimum wage increase. So why is this the case? How could this possibly happen? Well, the thing to remember is that before the minimum wage increase, the firm was actually willing to hire a lot more than 75 people. Right? In fact, before the minimum wage increase, right, the firm wanted to hire where wage equals marginal revenue product, right, which is to say where the wage was where $7.50, right, was equal to their marginal revenue product, which had been 30 minus 1/5 L, right? So this means that they wanted to hire where L was equal to 30 minus 7.5 times 5, which is going to be 112.5, right? Point is, they were willing to hire more than 100 workers, certainly more than 75 workers, at a wage of $7.50. The reason they only hired 75 workers is because that was the number of workers actually willing to work at a wage of $7.50. So what happens when we increase the wage they have to pay to $12 an hour, right, through minimum wage? Well, we increase the number of people willing to work from A to C, right? Labor supply increased from A to C, or I'm sorry, from here, right, from 75 to C, right? Labor demand decreased from 112.5 to B, right? The number of people we were willing to hire went from all the way out here back down to B. So we had an increase in the number of workers willing to work, decrease in the number of workers firms were willing to hire, exactly the same as we had in a competitive model. But because of the fact that to start out with, we had labor demand that was greater than labor supply, we can end up decreasing labor demand, increasing labor supply, and actually increasing total employment. This makes sense? So the reason we end up at B is because B is the number of workers firms are willing to hire at a wage of $12 an hour. Because this is above our competitive equilibrium wage of $10 an hour, labor demanded is greater than labor supply, right, which is equal to C. So our employment is going to be capped at labor demanded. This makes sense? If instead we had a minimum wage that was lower than $10 an hour, right, let's say that we had a minimum wage of $9 an hour, then we would have said that our equilibrium employment was going to be given where labor supplied by the number of workers supplied, C, right, because labor supplied is less than labor demanded. So the overall conclusion here is in a monopsony, right, when you have a minimum wage, the equilibrium employment is going to be whatever's less between the number of workers demanded by firms, the number of hours of, or the number of workers willing to work at the wage, right? And as long as whatever is less of those is greater than the original level of employment, we can end up with an increase in employment when we increase minimum wages. Okay, so this is telling us that it's possible in a monopsony to set a minimum wage and have as a consequence both higher levels of wages and increased employment, right? To have a minimum wage have uniformly positive consequences for workers. And I should point out, to increase the efficiency of the economy by getting us closer to, right, our efficient level of employment. So this raises a natural question, right? can we conclude that minimum wages are always going to increase employment so long as workers have market power? And the answer is no, right? This is a really, really important caveat. The answer is that we can only get increased employment from a minimum wage as long as our minimum wage is lower than our original marginal expense of labor, right? Let's think about why that is. If we set a minimum wage that was higher than our original marginal expense of labor, right? We're going to have employment set, just like before, by whatever is less between the number of workers demanded and the number of workers supplied, right? But now that the cost of an additional worker, right, the total cost of an additional worker is higher to firms than it was before, right? When before the total cost included both paying the worker a wage, but also giving everyone else a raise. Now that the total cost of a worker is higher than that, firms are going to end up hiring fewer people than they did before. Right? So what this model is going to tell us is that relatively modest minimum wage increases can have uniformly positive effects for workers, increase the efficiency of the economy. But very large minimum wage increases can have the same sorts of drawbacks as minimum wage increases in competitive economies, right? Where again, we're going to want to think about these costs and benefits the same way we would in a traditional model, where we ask questions like, well, how big is that employment loss, right? Which comes down to how elastic or inelastic is our demand for labor? How big are the wage gains? And then thinking about things like who is it who loses employment? Who is it who gains employment? So how big is big? Right, if we say that relatively modest minimum wage increases have uniformly positive effects on this in this market, whereas larger minimum wage increases have negative effects. How big is big is going to depend on how much market power there actually is. When the labor supply curve to a particular firm is really, really close to being horizontal, the gap between the wage being paid to workers and the marginal expense of labor, which is equal to their productivity, right, equal to their marginal revenue product, is going to be really small, right? If we have really, really flat labor supply curves like this, then essentially the raise we have to give each worker, right, dWdL is going to be small. We're going to have marginal expense of labor. It's really, really close to our wage rate. And there's going to be a fairly small minimum wage increase that's not going to result in decreased employment, right? On the other hand, if we have a really, really inelastic supply of labor to a firm, right? Firms have lots and lots of scope to set workers' wages. We might have a massive difference, right, between the amount of money workers are getting paid and the amount that workers are producing for firms. And we'll have a massive scope to increase minimum wages without affecting workers' employment, right, or increasing workers' employment. So I think the last thing I want to say, and then I'm going to let you go because I know I'm keeping you too long. Last thing I want to say about this is when we think about market power, when we think about monopsony, it's not just a question of whether there's market power, because the answer is almost certainly yes. It's a question of how much market power there is, right? It matters tremendously for which model of the economy is going to give us the best implications, we're going to be the closest to the truth, whether employers are able to adjust their workers' pay by a couple cents one way or the other without having major effects on employment, but couldn't have large changes in wage setting, versus whether employers have massive scope to set their workers' wages. Okay, said enough. I'm going to leave it there. Can't wait to talk to you about this over Zoom.